Well, hello everyone once again in the investment immigration world. This is Carolyn Lee, and I'm joined by my good friend and longtime EB-5 industry colleague, Ms. Christine Chen, the one, the only, who is the Chief Operating Officer, thank you very much, of CanAm Enterprises, which of course is one of the longest standing and successful EB-5 regional centers in the program history. So I'm just super delighted. And as we always say to ourselves and to others on these occasions, I think we go back probably 15 years or so. And
I would say so.
yeah, right?
I would say so. Thank you, Carolyn. It's always a pleasure to see you, and even a greater pleasure to be on a panel with you. So it's really great to be here.
Oh, thank you so much, Christine. This is going to be so much fun, especially because this topic could not be hotter. The only hotter topic is truly legislation. And so we're going to be having lots of conversation about that in the coming weeks. And no doubt we'll touch on it in this conversation as well. So as fans tuning in regularly to our monthly webcast know, we try to keep this conversation really conversational. It's not canned. I don't prepare in advance, so you are welcome to try to stump me if you ask questions. And Christine, also, I welcome that. We're bringing ourselves as we are so that we can be as candid as possible and really share with you our perspectives, our thoughts, our experience, and have that be a candid, live, real exchange of ideas in this moment. And we think that it's a special treat to those of you who are tuning in live as well. Before we jump into our topic of redeployment, of which there's a lot to say, I want to share some of the interesting tidbits that I gleaned listening to Charlie Oppenheim's first ever YouTube webinar just minutes ago. I think it's probably just wrapped up. But I was able to extract some facts of interest or some observations of interest from Charlie. So one of the big questions in my mind has been, what is going to be the overflow into the employment-based category from unused family-based categories, because consulates are still closed this year. So last year, coming into this fiscal year, fiscal 2021, we had over 120,000 unused family-based numbers coming into the employment-based side. Yeah, big number. And of that, we had over 8,000 being allocated to EB-5's normal annual limit of about 10,000. So we had about 18,000 numbers rather than our normal 10,000 this year. But of course, many are going to go unused because the consulates around the world, particularly Guangzhou, remain closed to, mostly closed to EB-5 visa processing. So the question has been, how many are we going to get next year, since we're hopeful that the consulates will be more open next year? And so he gave us some estimated numbers on that. He thought that 275,000, so this is a much higher number, 60,000 or so higher than last year, he expects will come over to the employment-based side from the family-based side. And of that, the 7.1% allocated to EB-5 will give us 19,500 EB-5 visas next fiscal year. So this is nearly double our normal monthly limit, yearly limit. So this will be the moment next fiscal year, really, when we're going to hope that the consulates open full operation. Dare we hope even for increased capacity, so that they're chugging through these numbers and really optimizing usage. And so let's all keep our fingers crossed, and to the extent advocacy makes a difference, let's keep at that. Another interesting piece of news was how many cases are documentarily qualified, or as Charlie put it, ready to go in Guangzhou, awaiting visa interview once the consulates reopen, or once that consulate in particular reopens to regular EB-5 processing. And he said there are about 9,000 that are presumably documentarily qualified, ready to go, and awaiting visa interviews. So we really need that consulate to be operational and open to EB-5 visa processing, and soon. One more tidbit on recapture. There was a question asked from the floor about whether or not State Department will recapture unused visas, and he reminded us all that recapture is not something that the agency or the State Department can do on its own. It has to be done legislatively. It was done twice before in the past, most recently in 2005. So as we think about legislative advocacy going forward under the Biden administration and so forth, that's something that we'll want to keep in our minds as well, is recapturing. There is an estimate, he didn't go into this at the presentation, but there's an estimate of over 200,000 numbers that could be recaptured. All right, now redeployment. Christine, give us a bit of the background. We're going to have a mix of knowledge base among our audience today. So lay it out for us. From your perspective, what's the background for this policy?
Well, I think that, well, it feels like we've been talking about this forever. But, I think that with the visa usage, primarily by Chinese nationals in the 2000 to 2015 era, the large number of visas always went to, especially as applicants came from Chinese nationals, the unused visas just went there. And at some point, other countries caught up. And obviously retrogression had been discussed and forecast for a number of years. And the issue of how to address the at-risk requirement by USCIS was we were all discussing what USCIS would require. So, I think there were a lot of theories and there's a lot of discussion, and USCIS does like to take its time in issuing. But in 2017, when they finally issued their policy memo on redeployment, it wasn't exactly unexpected. This need to redeploy the capital until they could file their I-29 petitions. Sometimes at the time, I think it was maybe 5 to 7 years for Chinese nationals. Obviously, that has escalated quite a lot. How to keep that at risk and out deployed for upwards of 15 years becomes a little bit mind-boggling from an investment perspective. And certainly our hope is that it will scale down, but USCIS the program has always required that the capital be at risk until the permanent green card application could be applied. No one had really ever envisioned that being a period so long. So I think we had all theorized, what would USCIS want? Is it just the capital that can't be repaid to the investor, but it could be in different investment structures? And there was a lot of discussion. I think that when the policy update finally came out, it was a little underwhelming. We were expecting guidelines, we were expecting what was allowed, what was not allowed, what kind of requirements would be. And the requirements were kind of generic, and all we were given were 2 examples. One was new issue municipal bonds and construction. And they were examples. They weren't categories, they weren't definitions. And so I think up until that, a lot of people thought, oh, we can put them in securities, we can put them in real estate funds. There was all kinds of things that were relatively liquid that could diversify someone's in EB-5 investors' capital, since they'd already put it at risk, since they'd already created the jobs that we thought would be viable. And I know that you were, deeply engaged in the conversations with USCIS at the time to try to get more clarity. We're like, there were so many stakeholders calls about redeployment, trying to get, does it have to be in a geographic area? Does it have to, and there was a lot of advocates on both sides. I think that there was definitely those who leaned more flexibly, like we did, saying, well, the jobs have been created. We should be able to just put the money into something that has a market return, but it's not in the hands of the EB-5 investor. Mm-hmm. And there were those who were saying, no, it has to be another EB-5 investment, I think on the other extreme. So I think that when you ask what is redeployment, it still is hard to say. We are guessing still based on the limited amount of guidance that we know from USCIS. Given I-829 processing times, we can't ask an investor to take a leap of faith that this should work, that USS should be reasonable. By the time they find out and a decision's made, it could be, there's no time to correct it. So I think most of us, I mean, certainly we ended up in the position of, we just have to pick these two examples. We have to fall within, and I think that's by and large what the industry has done, is we've just fallen into these two examples that USCIS provided, because we still don't really have a definition of what it is. I do think the concept of keeping the money out there is obviously met by these two examples, but I mean, I think that we are still looking for more guidance of what can be done over time with redeployment.
Absolutely. That's beautifully said. That lays out the problem and the current situation. And I think that when the important point, I think that everybody probably in this space and who's looked at redeployment, thought about it, have struggled with how best to redeploy. We've all struggled with how to make best sense of the guidance we had. As you say, it was underwhelming. I have some other words for it, but I think we're all on the same page as an industry, as stakeholders, in very much scratching our heads going, we really want to get this right. It's too important not to. But we can't make sense of this very, very well with a high degree of certitude that we're going to take actions that the USCIS will agree complies with its policy. So I think that's been a real challenge, and from the get-go. And then I think that the problems really have been exacerbated because, as you say, Christine, when we're talking about EB-5 capital and the volume of it and what's at stake with these investors and immigration and the duration of this process, we don't want to be guessing, and it's very hard to unwind the steps taken. And yet when USCIS promulgates policy and does so in a way that would affect cases that were filed before those policy updates came out, that's very, very problematic. And we have had that happen in the redeployment policy context. So I want us to get to that. I want us to cruise into the July 2020 USCIS redeployment policy update. Before we get there, so as a regional center and struggling with this guidance, what was your approach to it? You kind of gave us a sense of it, just getting into the material and the language and matching the facts. And what was your general approach to this that you think would be helpful for folks to hear? And what did you find helpful in that analysis? You mentioned examples.
No, absolutely. I think that, you know, prior to 2017, as everyone was talking about, right after retrogression had really been announced for mainland China, we all started tackling what would be acceptable to USCIS. And we kind of, you know, having gone through ups and downs with USCIS adjudication, we felt like maybe we had a grasp on what would be palatable to USCIS. You know, from our perspective, we really felt that job creation had been met. Definitely didn't need to be done. And a lot of those projects were ground up construction. So I think that level of risk, we also felt didn't need to be in the redeployment. Our investors had signed up for that EB-5 investment. They had successfully created the jobs, successfully gotten over the construction risk period. That's common with most of those investments. They should be able to put their money in something that yielded some market rate returns, that was fairly liquid because people would have different redeployment terms, and was a little bit more diversified, right? It didn't have to go into one project that was either going to make it or not make it. They could put a little bit in each one, and for that remaining period of time that they had suddenly found themselves needing to be in, they could feel like that capital would be preserved.
Let's talk about that a moment, because some folks in our audience may not know about that period we're talking about. So each investor, I think you mentioned, is going to have a different period of time that they have to remain invested. And then as the project, you're going to want ideally to have funds available or some level of liquidity to be able to repay that investor. So let's talk, what is that period?
So um, you're probably better positioned to talk about all the priority dates that come into play from different countries, but
From your perspective.
at a very kind of basic level, you know, when you sign up 100 investors for an EB-5 project, you know, historically, a lot of them have come from mainland China, and they will be in the same ballpark of priority dates just because of the allocation of visas to that country. But
Yeah.
then you'll have some from India and some from Vietnam, and which have been in the past. Vietnam still is retrogressed. India's current right now. This is just the ebbs and flows of priority dates. And then some people who just aren't. So, you know, for us, we would have a pool of investors who, out of that total 100 of investors, some would be eligible to repay when that EB-5 investment was done. Some of them would have to stay for maybe a year. Maybe they got delayed in getting their consular interview or something else that had nothing to do with retrogression. Then you had some Indian investors who were retrogressed for like a year or two. And then Vietnam's maybe, you know, a little bit longer. And then you have this large group of Chinese nationals who would be retrogressed for 5, 6, 7 or more years. So it would be, from our perspective, unreasonable to have that person to tie up all that money again into one project. We wanted the flexibility to, for as closely as possible, not being perfectly dovetailed, but that the investors who were retrogressed for 1 or 2 years could get their money back when they were done, once their I-29 petition was filed, while the other group of people who had maybe gone out for 4 years or 5 years, they would make that decision. Okay, I'm 4.5 years. I'm willing to have my redeployment investment come back in 5 years. It's a little bit longer, but it's close to my redeployment term. You know, it's a little bit challenging from a logistical perspective. And those times, just to make it a little more complicated, keep changing.
Right.
So, you know, at any given time, and like I said, it all depends on how many visas are available and how quickly priority dates by country advance. Whether our original plan for a redeployment investment based on the population of people and their redeployment terms when we redeployed, whether that stays intact, whether some of those times shorten. I don't think anyone will get longer. But it's challenging. We have to disclose that to investors, and it's hard for them to understand.
Right, especially how you have to modulate across different kinds of priority date classes, depending on origin of the investors. How about these COVID closures? Has that affected that calculation?
Well, we are, yes and no. I mean, at least for us, we're waiting to see. We had a very large redeployment last year. So that's what I'll refer to that experience. Our biggest EB-5 loan was repaid last year, which was great. But in the midst of all this, it was a population of 700 investors. And we were trying to figure out how many of those would be redeployed for longer terms, shorter terms, eligible to be repaid. And we were basing it on, at the time, I think we were doing calculations in spring of 2020.
Wow.
Consulates were closed.
Yeah.
We didn't realize they'd stay closed. Then there was talk about visas overflowing and that helping and moving things up.
Yeah.
So it was, and you know, and consulates have stayed closed. So now we're wondering, how does that impact things? It's been really challenging trying to explain that to, I mean, they understand it's out of our control, but they also don't want to tie their money up longer than they have to.
Right. And also as a regional center or fund manager, you only have so many options.
Yes.
Right? When you're looking at preservation of that capital, and you're trying to line up the potential liquidity of it with these different classes of investors, there isn't a universe of options to choose from for the ideal solution.
You had to be a little bit nimble and resourceful. And then honestly, sometimes just had frank conversations with investors.
I was just going to say, I feel like in this process that those investor communications seem more important than ever.
Yes.
And not to suggest that they have to be, you know, like intimate phone conversations day to day, but it seems like it is kind of challenged projects and regional centers to at least change or rethink or think more deeply about their communication strategy. What do you think? I mean, how is your approach to investor communications and redeployment?
And
Has it
I'll,
evolved?
well, I think that we within the EB-5 industry have been talking about redeployment a lot. I think there's been a lot of, especially when we were trying to get feedback from USCIS, there was a lot of analysis of what was reasonable, what was not reasonable. And so I think from an education perspective, we have probably thought and overthought redeployment to some extent. Now, how much of that education was really conveyed to investors in mainland China, who, as you know, most regional centers end up working through an agent, a migration agent in China. How much are they telling investors? So it's a bit of like a game of telephone, trying to educate a slightly complicated concept to begin with. Okay.
Right.
So we had at the beginning of 2020 started a whole series of educational kind of memos that we were sending out to agents.
Mm-hmm.
We had actually managed to get out to meetings in mainland China at the end of 2019 to meet with agents in preparation, getting them to understand our strategy, the advantages of our platform from our perspective compared to other strategies that might be taken, concerns that we felt investors might have. And as you can imagine, the reaction was all over the place. Some agents were along the lines of, oh, don't worry, this will be fine. And some agents would be like, I don't think our investors understand what redeployment is.
Yeah.
And I was like, how after so many years of this being in really a serious topic of conversation in EB-5, could they not do that? So
and these investors are upset to begin with, because they're not expecting to be in a 15-year line.
No. I think some of them, I think some of them weren't told about redeployment, even after all these years. And so it was a learning process for us, an ongoing learning process for us, how to have the conversation that is more educational, how to have the conversations that's more reassuring, how to have the conversation with the agent as an ally, how to have the conversation with the agent kind of as a source of perhaps wrong information. Some of those agents, as you know, with retrogression terms having gotten so long, some of them just left the business. So it was a bit of no one's talked to me in 2 years. What's going on? So it was a series of, formal kind of educational letters and memos that we put out. We tried to do videos. We did really basic animated videos to kind of explain why India is different than China.
I think what you're getting at is I'm really glad that you're speaking to that, because I think that that's really best practices in terms of reaching out to investors, particularly in China, where English is not the first language for the vast majority of your investors. To really have a communication strategy and to be flexible and to think about it being diversified. And my own approach in helping clients and also in doing educational seminars has been that that really, if you start from the premise that most people, especially in this space, are smart, informed, and reasonable. Not always, that's for every one of us. But if you start from those premises, then you can proceed and say, well, if we lay out the situation and take it upon ourselves to lay it out fully as accurately with all the complexities and ups and downs and the uncertainties that we can, then maybe the response back will be one that's reasonable. And that's been my experience, I must say, even in this area.
We really tried to take the approach from kind of not just our strategy of what we thought would be a suitable investment, but just in our conversations with investors. No one signed up for this. Even when you signed up for your EB-5 investment, 5 years ago and change, adjudication times were shorter. Yeah, retrogression was out there, but you thought maybe it was a couple of years. No one signed up to have your investment term double. Yeah. So we're not here. We didn't either. When we signed you up in terms of what we were going to do and our role and our service for them was for a 5-year period, maybe a couple more years to make sure they're made whole until their I-29 is approved and everything else because of timing issues. We're not trying to take advantage of you. We're just trying to do what's fair. We'll do the work. We understand at this stage, the responsibility for us is to make sure you get a fair shake, given this situation has really snowballed beyond anyone's expectations. And, so we went into conversations with investors, we understood that this isn't what your expectation was.
Mm-hmm.
So let's work together. Let's share with you our understanding of what a fair approach to redeploying your money is, so that you still get at the end of that process what you had hoped for.
I think also that's right. And I think also it when I make presentations, I do make the point often that a lot of the projects that are called to redeploy don't want to. They would want nothing more than to, when the money's back and repaid, to pay you out, because that was the
plan
expectation as well. So yeah, so I think that also helps. It's like we're kind of in this together.
And I think that it's important to keep the message and the conversation at that level. As EB-5, as the program really expanded and brought a lot more money into the United States, admittedly. Yeah. You had kind of operators like us. This is what we do. We do EB-5. Mm-hmm. We aren't developers. We find projects that fit the program requirements. We find investors that are looking for a green card. We try to match them up. That's where we look at ourselves. We're that bridge between those two entities. But there's been a lot of different stakeholders that entered EB-5. There are developers who are like, oh, well, I can put this money in my project, but my business is this development. I want to keep going doing my business. I don't have a full-time job figuring out how to redeploy this group of people that I never planned to be a continuing part of my business and where I'm spending my time and energy. I think you have, on the negative flip side, there's certainly the feeling that some people in EB-5 were like, great, now I can hold on to your money for like 15 years and I can do whatever I want. And I think that's a really predatory image that, doesn't help anybody in EB-5. I think we should, from my perspective, those are us who are in EB-5 for the long haul, as a number of us are. And we really rely on reputation. We really rely on a certain amount of trust from both sides, the EB-5 projects and the investors. It's really important that we stay on theme about it is in our best interest to make sure that everyone gets what they expected when they first signed on.
Yeah. Well, and what about, I have heard with great sympathy as well, regional center operators and fund managers say, well, thank God for redeployment. Because with China off the table, if we didn't have redeployment, we couldn't stay afloat.
Yeah, and I hear that. I'm not against it. There's work that's involved with redeployment. There's a lot of work involved in finding the projects, managing, because from our perspective, if you take our approach where you take a pool of money and you diversify it among a few projects instead of one big EB-5 project, because it is the more responsible thing to do. Now you've got like a few projects to manage. There's work involved in all that. So you can earn your fees. There's definitely work being done when you earn your fees. But as long as you take that kind of responsible approach, then I think it's all earned. I think the investors feel their money is being put into something that earns them a little bit more, that still preserves their capital. They can reasonably understand the structure of it. Mm-hmm. And meanwhile, the regional center, to your point, can stay afloat because, aside from China falling off the map, COVID's been really hard. We can't see our investors. We can't do client sales meetings. It's been challenging overall. So if redeployment, and I think from an economic stimulus perspective, successful EB-5 and successful redeployment shows how the program can continue to stimulate the economy when properly done. Mm-hmm. from our perspective, again, speaking from the redeployment that we did, end of last summer, there was it was COVID. The banks had really tightened up. A lot of projects that had been greenlit that had gotten bank financing, but banks as policy were pulling back on how much leverage they were willing to put in. There were some great opportunities, some really high quality projects that had been thought out, had been modeled, that had been greenlit, and they just were gaps. And so those were wonderful opportunities for us to put our investors' redeployment money into really high quality projects, So, and in the meanwhile, it kept these projects going instead of a construction site sitting stuck. And those people not knowing if they can continue because they've gotten 95%, 98% through the process to start work. It felt really like we were having impact.
Oh, that's so good. I love that. I really, really do. Because I'm a true believer that in challenging times, there are opportunities. And it's a matter of getting creative. So that's great. I love hearing that.
Yeah, I think, again, you have to think long term. EB-5, it's sometimes easy to take that short term.
Is it? When does that happen?
I don't know. I need to hear about it.
Very long.
I think that EB-5 just has always been such a wonderful program for those of us in it. Not every project's an EB-5 project, but the ones that are really meaningful to the communities that they're in. And I think redeployment can be part of that story when properly done.
That I'm gonna take that away. Let's talk about the July 2020 policy update, especially since that conversation has just been ongoing since then because well, let's just set the table. So the July 2020 policy update came out. It had changes to the prior written policy. It was applied, however, to cases already pending, 526s and 829s, i.e. it had retroactive effect. And the most notable change in that July 2020 policy update was a new policy about where the funds could be redeployed. Prior policy silent. The policy change, now the redeployment has to be within the original regional center geography, which could be really, less than a city, smaller than a city rather. So this was disturbing. When we asked for policy clarification, so we're not guessing, about how to redeploy. We didn't mean make something up and then apply it retroactively. And yet this is what happened.
2 years later.
2 years later. The policy came out.
Right, 2003 years later. Oh my God.
So what was your reaction to this? I can say a little bit about mine and
it was frustrating because that question came out in 2017 when we were looking for clarification. People were asking, and it was one of those things that had been asked, and I think pretty early on everyone was like, no, I don't think USS is going to hold us to that. And a lot of the early things were like, as you said, my regional center is like a neighborhood. That can't be what I have to redeploy into. We had certain, for our early redeployments, they're relatively short terms. So again, because we lacked.
Oh, hey, Christine, I'm not hearing you. Can you hear me? You're back. You're totally back. So you were saying in your early redeployments, they were smaller.
Oh, yes. So you can hear me?
Yes, you're coming through.
Okay. Yes, our early redeployments were shorter terms. So given the two options that the first USCIS policy memo gave us, we chose new issue municipal bonds for those shorter term redeployments. And it's challenging sometimes finding one in a city or in a neighborhood. So we had chosen, you start in that area and then you expand. And that felt like to us a reasonable effort on our part to start in good faith within our geography.
Bonds aren't issued for blocks, or very rarely.
No, not to mention new issue ones.
Yeah.
And getting a small allocation for whatever it is. So, we felt that we had papered that effort just in case, because there was lack of clarity, but that USCIS, I think largely we felt that USCIS would not come back on this issue.
Mm-hmm.
So we were really surprised when they did in July. We had, I think that this issue had kind of gone off everyone's radar for quite a while. So when it happened, aside from, we were prepared that we weren't the only ones for our already filed I-29 petitions that were outside the geographies. We felt like everybody would be battling this retroactivity, which is, it was going to be an issue that applied to so many already filed I-29 petitions. So it was going to be a bit of a conversation, but we probably weren't going to be fighting that fight by ourselves. And that was reassuring. It really applies to the industry at large. For our redeployment last year, this memo came out in July, end of July 2020.
Yeah.
Our project was repaying August 15th. So we had gone down. It was terrible timing. I mean, that day, our entire office was like, how are we supposed to pivot? I mean, this is a really big pivot. We had a lot of conversations with agents and with our investors about our platform, which was unlike EB-5. Yeah, your redeployment could be anywhere in the US. You could have geographic diversity in terms of your redeployment investment. And, a few months later, we're like, so never mind. We lucked out that our EB-5 project that was repaying was in Florida. Mm-hmm. We really lucked out. Florida is probably the second biggest state economy, maybe after Texas. So there was just a lot of activity going on. We had the unfortunate situation of telling developers that we had been in talks with in Seattle that I'm sorry, this was not our fault. We love your project, but USCIS, changed things midstream. And then we had to kind of really start over, having conversations with investors, explaining to them why this was now newly introduced, but was not going to adversely affect their investment decisions. We had to go look for projects in Florida that we didn't have relationships with.
And did you feel like the time frame you had was enough? Because we didn't talk about this yet, but part of the policy is that the redeployment has to take place within a commercially reasonable time, a standard that's never existed in EB-5 policy before. We have the reasonable period of time for creating jobs, if not all of them are created at the time of 829 filing, but not commercially reasonable. So we didn't know what that meant. We do have a little more clarity in the July 2020 policy update. There's a default rule, if you will, of 12 months. Do you feel that 12 months is okay? What do you think about that?
For us, it was fine. We had proceeded because of the lack of clarity with a 6-month timetable. So we had given ourselves an internal timeline of like the beginning of 2021. So now we have a little bit more actually flexibility, which given the size of the redeployment was very appreciated. So, again, I'm only speaking to our circumstances. We found a lot of very attractive projects with really great sponsors in Florida. Just give you some perspective, because I know there are practitioners out there trying to figure out how to deal with their situations. We had ultimately between people who were repaid, people who had decided that EB-5 wasn't for them after all, we ended up having to redeploy about $225 million. Mm-hmm. We have found about 6-7 projects, in that period of time since August. We hustled. But, you know, I think that our investors are really pleased. We have everything from multifamily to commercial buildings to student housing, really great developments. Some of them are new construction, some of them are repositionings, you know,
but from a management standpoint, that's very different, right? Than from monitoring one loan, one borrower.
but, you know,
Is that different? It's got to be different.
it is. I think for an operator like CanAm, where we always had a multitude of EB-5 projects going on, we had to have a system where we could monitor, you know, 20, 30, 40 EB-5 projects at any given time anyway. It's slightly different communications. It's a little bit more frequent. And, you know, it's changing what we're monitoring. It's clearly not job creation, but we really want to look at, are they hitting their milestones for, you know, repayment of capital, distributions and everything else. But from a capacity level, it's something that we were positioned to do. Now, I fully understand that regional centers who did a deal a year, that's hard.
Yeah.
It's hard. It's a lot of work. I mean, we have an entire department that you know, tracks our projects and generates reports and, you know, then sends those.
You were just able to kind of replicate that model of operation into the redeployment scenario.
But it's, you know, there's an infrastructure that's needed to kind of keep that going. And, you know, to your point about communications, not just about redeployment, because it's a kind of a different phase of their EB-5 life, shall we say, but also with COVID, you know, communication has become so much more important. They want it much more frequently. They want much more detail.
And so when you say your investors have been happy, how do you know in terms of communications back from that side?
You know, so we've been sending out, you know, we've been certainly taking the approach that more communication is better during COVID. So, you know, out of these 6 or 7 deals that we're about to close the last batch of deals in this redeployment. But we've been sending out, you know, closing letters. This is the one benefit of giving a report on more than just one project. We've been sending out reports on a lot of them, you know, where they're going, photos, status reports. So, you know, they come back and say, we appreciate, because there was a little bit of questioning about where their money was going.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, don't blame them, right?
Yeah. So, you know, for us to be able to, it's a lot of legwork, but for us to say, you know, this project is here, this other project is there, and here's the status report of the other ones that are almost, you know, have closed recently and the 2 that are about to close, or whatever it is, it's really a very engaging dialogue, which I think you will understand kind of the way investor communication about EB-5, which was a little bit more, I don't want to say formulaic, but it was always about certain factors, right? Is the project completed? Have the jobs been created? When am I going to get repaid? Yeah. There's just a more dynamic conversation that happens now because it's a true investment that's the way we positioned to them. So
very, very interesting. There is a question on the floor about litigation. And so, so there is a complaint that's been filed. It was filed earlier this month. The plaintiff was the Civitas Group. There were about 20 plus new commercial enterprises, and a suit was filed against the government, USCIS DHS, for its redeployment policy on the issue of geography, the geographical restriction presented in the July 2020 policy update or policy change, and its retroactive impact, given that under the prior written policy, there was no prohibition. And therefore, a number of regional centers have redeployed outside their original geographies. And those deals you cannot pivot on a deal that's already been done without violating the terms of your investment agreement or loan agreement with your borrowers, investment targets. So that's the subject of that litigation. Christine, do you have any thoughts on that?
I mean, I think we, like the rest of the EB-5 stakeholder community, is looking to see, I think there's 2 things kind of at play: the litigation and the first I-29 petitions with RFEs referencing the new policy memo have just been issued. You know, it's a bit of a relief for us that we're not the guinea pigs, because we have been in the past. So I think are all
Trailblazers, I like to call.
That's a more positive connotation. But I think that we are all looking to see how the industry responds, because I think it will be an industry response to these individual filings.
I hope so, right?
I think so. I think we're all very invested in having USCIS come to a reasonable conclusion about retroactivity. That the petitions that were filed in good faith prior to the policy memo should be left alone. They should be adjudicated along the lines of the previous policy memo. We certainly understand that even the day of, as long as the petition was filed afterwards and that redeployment was filed afterwards, as long as, even if you had to scramble, there had to be a good faith effort that those petitioners and those regional centers were trying to, pivot to the new rules in order to comply with USCIS guidance. But I do think it will be an industry response.
So, and these are not crazy, far-reaching, like overreaching concepts. It's just.
I know. I've been in this business a long time, as have you, and I think we remain optimistic. USCIS, although it periodically issues these kinds of disturbing policy memos, they've been reluctant to apply retroactivity. I hope it stays that case. I think sometimes they do it maybe to sound serious and for those of us in EB-5 to take what they recommend seriously.
Mm-hmm.
But I do hope that in terms of actual adjudication, they are reasonable.
Well, I was starting to feel quite optimistic, actually. And I still am. I don't know what the impact of having been sued is going to be. Yeah. But I was feeling optimistic that with the change in administration and with the new DHS head, who has experience with EB-5, who's knowledgeable about the complexities, that we would have a reversal of that policy. Only insofar, to be very, very modest, it should be the geographic restriction should not be retroactive. It should only apply to redeployments taking place after that, and really ideally sometime after that policy was first published in July. That's how we do things, with notice and comment. And I think that I'll just get on my soapbox for 1 minute. USCIS does have a history of adjudicating and making policy through adjudication. Yes. And it's difficult even when you have an H-1B with an individual professional in a position. With EB-5, those consequences are multiplied because you're dealing with millions of dollars. You're dealing with lots of families in the exact same project. You're dealing with transactions that cannot be undone.
Right.
So you cannot have stakeholders who, again, want nothing more than to comply. They literally cannot comply when policy is made retroactive.
Absolutely.
So, I was very hopeful that this would be the poster child for why the service has to promulgate new policy with advance notice and comment. And I'm still hopeful, honestly. Again, I don't know what the impact of the litigation is on any kind of internal moves that USCIS may make, but I hope that we'll see a change in the procedural way that USCIS rolls out new policy.
Well, you may be a little bit more optimistic than I am. I'm willing to live with, USCIS.
I have as little reason as you do.
I will agree with you, though. Having, the one benefit of having been in the business so long is that, you speak about Mayorkas kind of being involved in what that impact may be. He, I don't expect him to give special.
No.
But
he's not going to have the bandwidth.
No, but I will say that the past 4 years we have been in EB-5, and it's been unofficially obstructionist. processing times, it's just this complete lack of transparency. There's no communication. There's little glimmers of hope that some of that is changing. You know, the fact that we are not having these scripted, you can't talk to anybody type conversations. The fact that they're actually taking questions again is, I know it's a very small glimmer of hope, but I would hope that even if they want to stay opaque, they will take serious consideration of what their decisions do, even if we have to live through policy through adjudication, because that's been it for such a long time. As long as the decisions at the end are fair, even if they take way too long, we can live with it, because that's really what it is. We want to know that in the end, they're going to get a fair shake, that they met the requirements. And, you know, and I do think that Mayorkas has been through, we lived through, you know, when he was helming EB-5, that there were changes in policy through adjudication. There was
in occupancy, for example.
Exactly. And we got through it. You know, he gave, I don't know what was going on behind, you know, behind USCIS doors, but there was at least enough dialogue and conversation where the goal was to be, what does the language say? What was intended? What did they try to do? You know, I do feel that, as convoluted as the process sometimes felt, outcome supported that.
Yeah, I think ultimately you are as optimistic as I am, because I think what you're saying is the process of getting to the right result might be long and painful.
Yes.
But most times you will get there.
I'm just not sure the process is going to get any better.
I'm optimistic. I truly am, because it can't.
I hope you're right.
Away.
I hope you're right. We've suffered through enough of these. It would be great for that we got a little bit more efficient at getting, you know, communication going. I do think EB-5 has been a huge thing. I certainly think that USCIS has seen a lot of attention. The fees from EB-5 are really significant for you know, their operations. You know, let's try to look at it from the right perspective. You know, there's well-meaning projects out there, well-meaning investors. There's ones that need to be weeded out, but you know, by and large, it's been a really successful program for the United States. So,
amen. All right, so we let's take some questions, and we have been addressing some that have come up. There's one question that says, and Christine, if you see one that you want to take, let me know. So at point of redeployment, some Chinese investors want to exit with withdrawing their 526s and have their money back. What's your practice in refunding their money and document-wise to satisfying USCIS, so not to jeopardize the other EB-5 investors in the projects?
Yeah, that I can answer.
Okay.
You know, I think that, again, we approach the whole redeployment prospect from a, what did you sign up for? Question. And certainly, you know, we clearly understood that some investors were not told about retrogression. They thought it might go away. And so, look, we're not looking to try to keep anybody in the project or to pursue their 829 if that's not what they want. If they've changed their minds, and certainly 2020, relationships between the US and China were very strained. You might not feel it's a good decision. Maybe your reasons for seeking that green card in the first place have changed. Our perspective was, to the person who asked the question, you know, how do we want to give the investors the opportunity to withdraw while preserving, obviously, everyone else's ability to continue with their I-29 petitions. From our perspective, they had to give us notice by a certain date, because obviously it was a lot to juggle logistically. I think that we had certain paperwork. They had to sign a form, obviously fully understanding what withdrawing. There was no, you know, takebacks on any of that. And they had to submit, they had to give to us paperwork that they had withdrawn their application. Certainly, as the person who asked the question highlighted, the biggest danger from our perspective was the possibility of this person's I-5, their petitions still being out there in USCIS while we had returned the capital. So sometimes, you know, I'm sure some people felt a bit convoluted, but we felt that it best protected, you know, us as an operator, the other investors in it, and certainly, you know, the ability to keep this refund withdrawal option available to people whose circumstances just changed.
So this would be in your discretion as manager.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly have heard that, you know, that was not necessarily the case with, you know, the way other redeployments have been handled, depending on the vehicle where the dollars went into. You know, certainly this is the benefit of us kind of carving up that big pool of money into multiple projects. We could deal with the size of the redeployment pool changing. And this is, you know, with EB-5, you know, you had all the money going into one project. It would just kind of come in on a rolling basis, you know, so you could kind of get to eventually that dollar amount. With redeployment, you need to decide strategically, how are you going to redeploy in a way where you don't have certainty, at least from our perspective, of how much you can redeploy at the end of that process. So, you know, we wanted to give our investors that ability to withdraw and get refunded, as long as they made it clear that they were withdrawing their I-526 petitions as well. But it meant some practical aspects we had to figure out from our end.
You know, I also appreciate the point that you made. It starts with what you signed up for, which may not be what you like from either party's standpoint, or maybe both parties' standpoint, the investor and the project. But it does seem like, from my observation as a non-corporate lawyer, as an immigration lawyer, that is where the process does start. And you know, if the documents contemplate a reinvestment or redeployment, but yet as an investor, you want out, but you know, your project is taking the standpoint of, well, the agreement says what it does. Right. And they might, in the exercise of their discretion, allow those discretionary withdrawals, but that the document says what it says. I think it's kind of a harsh lesson in a way, but it is where it does start. It's what the parties agreed to.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think from our perspective, we looked at what the language in our limited partner agreements said, which obviously they were drafted before redeployment was contemplated. And so, you know, they're all in the interest of protecting the investor. You know, a lot of them will require a certain level of approval and voting by the remaining limited partnerships in the investment. So, you know, for us, we had to understand, how do we follow the bylaws of our limited partnership agreement? How do we enable what we think is fair? How do we protect the rights of the people who remain? So, you know, there are certainly that's certainly the approach we took. You could go the other way. You could say, you signed up for this limited partnership agreement and these, you know, operating docs 5 years ago. It says that we have discretion to decide what to do when certain things come up, and redeployment came up. You know, I do understand that. And this is the danger of legal language in English. And then you have investors coming in from that where they don't speak English. It's hard enough understanding what the language says in English.
No,
it's not that bad. But you know what I mean? It just doesn't feel right to take advantage of language that was drafted for something else to implement keeping investors in, making decisions for them and everything else. I mean, it's tricky, right? We had such a large pool of investors. We couldn't be it just was logistically impossible for us to do what we did with EB-5. In EB-5, we gave them an offering with the project. It described the project. They knew what they were going into when they signed on. For redeployment, we didn't know what our final pool of investors was going to be. We needed to have discretion about what projects that money was going into, because we couldn't find one project for an unspecified amount of money. We couldn't find 5 projects for an unspecified amount of money. We came to a compromise, again, with the what did I sign up for? We came to a compromise that gave us the flexibility to find projects after they consented to redeploy. But they were given the parameters of what those projects would be. The onus was on us to find projects that could meet those parameters. But they knew how long there was a max and min in terms of the term limit, how long the money would be outstanding.
Mhm.
There was a max and min or average of what the return was going to be, asset types and everything else. We tried to be as transparent with them in the amendments that had to be made to those agreements. That also just made it practical for us to go find good projects for them. So, it was definitely a lot of, I know we talked with you at some point, does this do what it needs to do? Because we're all kind of in uncharted territory with, how do you revise this language? How do you do it in a way that's clearly about enabling redeployment that doesn't trigger USCIS to say there's a material change and everything else? So it's a fine line. Ultimately, we think that we're comfortable that this will be acceptable to USCIS and also is in the best interest of our investors. And like I said, I think so far we're very pleased with what we've been able to redeploy into, much more than, we thought July 2020.
I think this is a fantastic note to end on. And I think you've given everyone a wealth of information based on your experience and some considerations for best practices. So Christine Chen, COO of CanAm, thank you for joining me. We're going to have you back. And for our audience, our next webcast, the topic will likely be, wait for it, visa backlogs and managing potential sunset, which we all hope is not going to happen, and that we instead will have a 5-year reauthorization for the good of investors, stakeholders, and industry. So we're going to hold out for that hope. We think we're going to get there. Christine, thank you again.
Thank you, Carolyn. It's always a great pleasure.
See you.
Talk to you soon. Bye.
Bye, everyone.